Hello and welcome. So this is what's next for Jamstack. I'm just going to turn the music off. I'm really excited to be here. This is going to be a lot of fun. So we have 4 amazing panelists today, and we're going to be duking it out over the definition and the bounds of Jamstack. So yeah. Let's do it. Let's do a quick round of introductions to the panel. Let's start with Salma.
Hi, I'm Salma, or you might know me as White Panther from the Twitch, which you are all on here today. I don't know what to say, right? I currently work for Get Sentry. Why did I say Get Sentry? Because that's the Twitter handle. I currently work for Sentry as a developer advocate. I used to work for Netlify, which was the original origins of the Jamstack. Got a lot of experience with the jammiest of stacks, and I'm here to say words today. That's all I got.
Nice. We like words. Cassidy.
Hello. Okay, I'm very sick today, and so my voice is really down here, but I'm trying to fake it. Hey, everybody. I'm Cassidy. I also used to work at Netlify, but now I'm working over at a company called Contenda, and we're building an app called Brainstory that lets you talk through your thoughts. And I like websites. And I wore a shirt that says I make websites today to really emphasize that.
Awesome to have you here. Bryan.
Hey, y'all. Yeah, I'm Bryan. I am the head of developer relations at HighGraph, but primarily I like to make things statically, I guess. And I adore the Jamstack and miss the Jamstack and want the Jamstack back. And that's maybe why I'm here.
That's why we're all here. Glad to have you here. Zach.
Hey, I'm Zach Leatherman. I'm a developer advocate at Cloud Cannon, and I also created the 11D static site generator.
Welcome, Zach. And I'm Mike. I'm going to be, hosting the panel today. And I've been passionate about static sites for a long time, and excited to see what's next for Jamstack. All right, so we're going to be building a Jamstack cake today. So we're going to start off. Every cake needs a good foundation. So let's start with that. So for what's next for Jamstack, first we need to understand what those core tenets of what the approach is, and just trying to get some alignment and agreement on that. So does anyone have any thoughts about what those core concepts around what the Jamstack should be about?
The way
we start.
The way I've described it in the past is you build as many things as statically as possible up front, and then you pull in data and new things as needed. Just kind of keeping it simple.
I like saying a folder full of files.
I like the idea that at its base there needs to be pre-generated HTML. Not everything, but somewhere in that stack.
And I like to say HTML first, JavaScript later.
So
I like that.
Yeah. So let's expand because I think we all agree on that core pre-rendered part. How far does that go? And where does it get gray and where does it stop?
Yeah. And I kind of talked with you about this, Mike, where it's kind of like treating the browser as an operating system, where like in a mobile app, for example, they build a lot of different components and then you kind of just pull in, call APIs, do what you need. And there's some stuff that happens on the phone itself, in the app itself, but then most of it is like built ahead of time. And the browser has that capability. And so I kind of treat it like that kind of operating system where you build the app in as much of the browser at build time as possible, compile it, and then you pull in things to make it interactive with the user.
Building on that, building on that, I'd like to say, as part of the foundation, it's like without, I don't know, sometimes a lot of people say that, okay, obviously you can't build a website without JavaScript these days. But I like to say that one of the foundations of the Jamstack is that with no JavaScript, you can see the site, you can see content, you can see things, which nods towards the whole pre-builded stuff. I mean, the thing is, you can pre-build your pages and your sites, and then once it's loaded in the browser, you can then use JavaScript to do all sorts of fancy stuff and add stuff later. So I think sometimes you have to go a little bit further than just saying pre-building, and in that, without JavaScript, you can still consume the medium, maybe.
I think it's sort of funny to look at some of the history behind some of these things too, because I think when Jamstack sort of came about originally, single page applications weren't really server rendered at that point. It was all sort of like generating all of the markup in the client when you're building a single page application, and things sort of changed, I think maybe around 2018, 2019 or something like that. And so it's sort of fascinating to see the I don't know, the dichotomy between, we want everything to be pre-generated, right? But when Jamstack first came about, single page applications were also part of the Jamstack, but none of the markup was pre-generated. A lot of it in that architectural style was generated on the client. It's not really like that anymore, but yeah, that's kind of an interesting maybe side perspective to that.
Is there kind of a dichotomy there? Like I remember, early Jamstack stuff and hearing from people basically in the early days, or not the super early days, but the early days, like it was 11D and Gatsby were like the two like strong sides to it, right? Everything HTML or everything client rendered. Do we think that the Gatsbyification on that side has become the SSRification, and we still had this other thing over here that is pure pre-generated, or is it messier than that?
When I spoke to Mike about this concept, sorry, you were about to answer the question, weren't you, Zach? I'm such a terrible
No, that's
panelist.
fine. No, it's okay.
I'll add an aside. When I spoke to Mike about this concept and what Bryan said, the SSRification, I think because SSR capabilities have been built into frameworks nowadays, people are doing that more and more because they can, not because they need to, but just because it's available to them. And one of the things is that a lot of the starter templates in these frameworks, they come with just everything SSR because you can. And I think that's where maybe the lines have got a bit blurred. I'm using a framework that works on the Jamstack, but you're just SSRing everything because you can. Zach, please continue.
I mean, I think the other point of confusion is that the definition, I think, of SSR has changed. Yeah, some people think of SSR in terms of like request time rendering, which is maybe a completely different definition if you think of SSR as just pre-generated HTML. So it's not request time generated, but it's built as part of your build. And I think there's been some maybe gray areas that people have used to their advantage in terms of marketing when it comes to using SSR, and maybe the dual definitions there, especially when it comes to client-side rendered JavaScript frameworks. So yeah, I know that didn't answer Bryan's question, but now I've forgotten what Bryan's question was.
It was forgettable. It's fine.
That's what panels are all about.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Mike, we need your help to rein it in.
Yeah, like actually, I want to go further on that one. So the reason, like, at least my understanding of why Jamstack was coined in the first place is we had a lot of complexity in the WordPress world. We have this wide ecosystem of plugins, and you've got the LAMP stack with lots of moving pieces that all have to fit together to render a web page on demand. And Jamstack said, we don't need to do that. We can just pre-generate a site, put it on a web server, and it will just work. It will scale. You won't get like not DDoS, like the Hacker News or Dig or whatever the thing was at the time. You won't get hacked. It's simple. You, as a web developer, you get to understand every line of HTML. It's handcrafted rather than if you look at a WordPress's source code, only a browser can really understand that. And that, I feel like that everyone kind of has that story of getting to Jamstack. Like I was in that world and this was a breath of fresh air, but we hit limitations of like, oh, okay, like I want to build this interactive thing. So, that's what Spa is good for. I want to but Spa is slow and it has a loading screen. Okay, SSR. And we really have come full circle on a lot of these things. And I think that's maybe one issue we had as the Jamstack community is with each limitation, the definition got broader and we didn't just kind of draw a line in the sand and say, that other stuff is valid and useful, but it's not part of this approach.
There was a lot of people saying that could be Jamstack too, and then it just
and it's a slippery slope, right? That now everything's Jamstack, all modern web development.
When we talked on Mike, everyone else gets to reference the conversation with Mike, so I'm going to reference my conversation with Mike about like is serverless, serverless functions, are those Jamstack, and how at one point they were considered ancillary to Jamstack, and then it was like they're definitely Jamstack. But as soon as you get serverless functions, that's when we get Next, and that's when we get everything rendering and shipping in serverless functions. And like that's that slippery slope argument at that point. I love serverless functions. Are they a part of the Jamstack?
Yeah, I think we need to separate those things, right? Those are two different. Cassidy, sorry. Yeah, the analogy I want to use here is, okay, we're trying to create a club about cycling, and we have two people wanting to join. One has an electric bike, and one has a cyber truck. How do you decide who's allowed in?
Well, a cyber truck isn't a bike, is it, Mike?
You can barely fit a bike in the back.
And that's obvious. It's like saying the lamp stack isn't Jamstack. Like a WordPress site isn't Jamstack. That's like the Cybertruck equivalent to an 11T site, right? So that isn't. Should it be less obvious?
Yeah, I mean, there is a gray area here. Like, I think maybe going back to Mike's analogy, maybe just like an old school cycle versus an electric bike. I think there might be some folks that have trouble with an electric bike in a cycling group. I don't personally, but yeah, I mean, I could see how folks would want to draw lines there. I think that if you're building a community around something, it's maybe less helpful to draw those hard lines. But I also am very tempted to say that serverless functions are ancillary or outside of the core Jamstack principles. So I'm sort of contradicting myself here.
I think you're bringing up an interesting new word into the conversation, right? We were talking about a tech stack before, but you said the word community, and Mike kind of alluded to it with this idea of club, right? Mm-hmm. If you're building a community, you want people in your community and you want them in general around a certain topic-ish. But you want a lot of people because you want to like hang out with people. You want to learn from people. You want to, if we're talking capitalistically, you want to capitalize on the people and the eyeballs and all that, right? I have strong opinions there. But you want a lot of people in that community for a variety of good and bad reasons. So you make the term as broad as possible to bring in more people. If Next is not Jamstack, do you get as many people in a Jamstack community as you would if Next is considered Jamstack? And the answer is no, you don't. Like everyone's talking about Next all the time now. So you get a much smaller community, but small doesn't necessarily equal bad unless you're trying to make money off of it.
Does anyone have any thoughts there?
Yes, but I'm not sure I should say them. Carry on.
Oh, well, I also agree that small isn't necessarily bad, but also you don't want it to be so exclusive that people are just like, oh, I guess I can't learn this, or oh, I guess this isn't for me, that kind of stuff, which I think happens with a lot of frameworks where people realize that this community attached to this technology is not one that I want to be a part of, so I guess I shouldn't learn this technology or something.
I think there is a balance, because I think, because as Mike was saying, that the Jamstack ended up getting, the definition of Jamstack ended up getting broader and broader, and more things were encompassed in it. The community therefore got broader and bigger to a point where there was no real semblance of any relationships anymore. And I think in order to forge the relationships that you want to in a community, you need to start off small, and you need to start off constrained. And that's what it did do. And then it got bigger. And again, we're going full circle. And I'm not sure that I don't know whether we can achieve all of those things simultaneously. I think you either keep it small and kind of exclusive, and you make a very definite circle around what Jamstack is and isn't, or you broaden it out a little bit and then you end up in this position again.
So there's an interesting point on that too, where there's a value proposition to the community, not for companies, but for the people who are in it, right? Mm-hmm. And in a lot of ways, one of the things, if we're looking at it from a community perspective, is what was the value that the or those Jamstack communities brought to the people in them? Because interestingly, one of my favorite parts about being in the Jamstack community in various ways, in the Slack group, in the Discord, on Twitter, wherever it was honestly, I didn't have to go looking for news about technology that I cared about. And that included, everything like 11 all the way up through Next and all these things. It included all of that. And I got that information without going to a whole bunch of different places. The laziness inside me said, the community's bringing all of this to me. It's amazing. And if you make it too niche, you don't get that. But that's just the value that it brought me. There's a lot of other value that it can bring. I'm kind of wondering, what do y'all think that the value of that community was to the people in the community?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's the cross tooling community sharing that happened. It wasn't, because it does kind of feel like when we are talking about specific tools, people start with their tool chain first and form their community around that. And for me, the Jamstack, the real value proposition of the Jamstack for a participant was, meeting people outside of the community that I was already in, and getting introduced to folks that are doing things maybe a little bit different than me, but that still shared some of the same core values that I put into my development stack too.
What I appreciated about Jamstack in general was that because it wasn't limited to a technology, there was never people being just like, or I shouldn't say never, but it was rarely people being just like, oh, you write in Vue, you suck, go React, or anything like that. Like it was all like similar ideas and just various ways of building it. Once again, I'm sure there were elements of that in corners where I didn't hang out, but it was generally, it felt friendly because it was about ideas around things and different ways of building stuff.
I agree with that. Someone asked me a similar question yesterday, and they said to me, why don't you align yourself with a framework when you teach? Why aren't you making like Next.js content or Vue content? It's like, well, because that's not what it's about. Like, these different frameworks are all valid in their own ways and solve different problems and have different benefits in their own ways. And again, so I've been discovering recently by answering that question that's why I was drawn to the Jamstack community. It's because it was about a way of building, not what you're building with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, interesting. I agree. I just want to shout out one of the comments here. We've got Lady of Code communities, collectives of people who share values and principles. They aren't going to be for everyone. I'd assume that some nature of exclusivity by default as a result. I think I want to go back to the cycling analogy. Like, we have our like cycle club. If you make it a vehicle club, then you have your Cybertruck people and your bicycle people in the same group, and they don't really have anything to talk about other than our wheels are both round. And 20 inches. I don't know. But then, so you shrink it down so people will have more in common. And maybe you say, okay, we've got bikes and electric bikes, a lot more in common. But there's still like, by broadening it, you're going to have some like, I guess, tooling and shared values that are different between those kind of two concentric circles. The electric bike people are going to be talking about battery sizes and maybe how fast they can go up hills, whereas the regular cycling people are more about tuning their gears. I'm not a cyclist, in case you can't tell.
Like, I know what wheels are. They're circles that move.
I've seen one before.
But yeah, I mean, with
how do we
this
balance
analogy, it could be like Jamstack is this umbrella thing with a bunch of little communities inside of it, where there's the two-wheelers, there's like the electric two-wheelers and the pedal two-wheelers, there's the four-wheelers. They got ATVs, but they've also got Cybertrucks. I don't know, and like overall we can be friends, but there's sub-communities in it. And I think that is what we saw in a lot of Jamstack days, where there's just sub-communities in the big interest.
And that was reflected in how like the Slack and the Discord were organized. There were channels for Next.js, for Vue, for Eleventy, and that again split out those sub-communities and, you know, might have caused the whole, oh, my framework's better than yours. You know, but I don't know whether that's the answer, because again, it introduces segregation and separation from the outset when you want to forge relationships that don't have any walls between them, because we've got to that point where there are lots of walls and lots of branches of logic in the definition of Jamstack right now. So I don't know whether that would solve the problem.
Yes, we need to simplify the Jamstack by making it three definitions of the Jamstack is what I've heard, but that's neither here nor there.
It was really nice though, where there were times where I was stuck on something and I just needed to talk it out with someone. So I would have a React problem. I was talking with a Vue developer and they said, well, in Vue, this is how I would do it. And even though it had nothing to do with React and it was an opposite direction, I got to learn something about Vue, think about it in a different way, and then solve it in a different way. And so I'm okay with having some segregation of interests within a community. That being said, it is hard to start a community without, like, again, the core rules in place that you can then dive deeper into.
And we're all kind of builders, right? Like we've all built products or done user experience or done all these different things. And I think like a community, because I think we're almost done talking about what the Jamstack is as a technology, right? It's not a technology, and it never has been, right? Even back in Matt Billman's first presentation about it, it really wasn't. But like the community is a product. Like it's like even a community of place, like my neighborhood. If you think of it as a product, I can build the community better by thinking about my users. And so we have these users. Well, we don't have them. They're all gone. They're all in their separate communities. So what is the intrinsic thing that's the siren call to get them back into an umbrella community versus the individual communities? What's the value that a Jamstack community can bring to these people that is obvious to them that they'll want to come into?
Yeah,
I like what Linda said in the chat, where as long as it feels easy to move between sub communities, I feel like that's really nice. I like the lack of vendor lock-in. I think that's a really big factor in all of this. Framework lock-in, language lock-in, vendor lock-in, all of that. I like feeling free to be just like, well, I built this and this, built this and this. Sometimes it means that my brain hurts, but it's fun to build in different ways and learn from different types of people.
So
I've been building in Next and Astro and making that switch back and forth. They're just so subtly different, and it hurts.
Subtly, yeah.
So let's dive into that. What are the shared values that we think this community has that isn't just like a broader web development community? Like we were talking about pre-rendering before, and perhaps some sprinkling of JavaScript and serverless. How do we kind of wrap that up in a box?
What's interesting is when you say values to me, Mike, I immediately don't think of how the website is built. I think of, oh, we're really nice people and we won't tell you to go away if you like to do something a different way. That's what value is to me. So I'm wondering if the word value for that kind of thing, I think maybe
That's
you
fair.
want like concepts
Yeah. Is
or
belief, does that work? Or maybe it suffers from the same problem?
We don't want to be culty.
Yeah.
Or do we?
There's enough coding cults in the world. We're not a cult here.
pillars.
Pillars, that's good. I like
Pillars,
that.
yes.
So
I
what are
guess
the
it goes back to
pillars
the
of Jamstack?
technology at that point, right? It's not like there's the community, which is really what the Jamstack is, but the pillars of the technologies that form the community, like that's the like shared like community of practice, right? Like people who are building sites in a general same way. What are the pillars that they're interested in? I mean, the original Jamstack had, some of the things that we probably would still say, but I feel like nowadays the burn that we've all kind of been through on it, there's probably some additional ones as well.
For
Definitely
myself, if I were to just like introduce myself as a Jamstack developer, I'd be like, "Hi, I'm Cassidy. I fear servers and don't ever want to touch them." Yeah, just leave it at that.
That's great.
Yeah, I'm curious how that sort of reconciles with the Jamstack 2.0 pivot that we've talked about maybe previously. Because when you think of server administration, how do you define that when you don't want to touch a server? Because I feel the same way. Like I don't want to touch a server, but like when you get into request time generated frameworks, you are in some respects dealing with the server more.
Yeah.
You aren't doing any server administration, and you are having maybe a more brittle application in terms of it could fail in production much more easily. So yeah, I guess I have trouble with the line between not doing servers and the Jamstack 2.0 pivot, where it tried to be maybe it's sort of a larger umbrella tent.
It's just web development.
Yeah, I have a hard time reconciling that.
Yeah. I actually, so yesterday a friend of mine, she said that she wanted to learn how to code, but she wasn't sure where to start. So I sat down with her for just like an hour and I taught her HTML and CSS, where I was like, these are what tags, this is CSS. And I used like I said that HTML is a noun, CSS is an adjective, and then JavaScript is a verb. And like, if you think of it that way, that's kind of how these things are structured. And I was just like, you don't necessarily need to add the CSS or the JavaScript. It could just be on the page. And so I kept it super, super basic. We didn't actually get into JavaScript at all. So she just had like a website with text and an image, a link, stuff like that. And there was a point where she was like, wow, so all websites are built like this? And I was just like, kind of. I mean, like at the core, you could view the source of a website and you will see HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And she was just like, so this just works. I can put it on the internet. I said, yeah. And I showed her like how to just throw it on Netlify really quick. And she like stared at it for a second and said, I always hear about software developers fixing bugs. Like, what would a bug be with this? And I was just like, well, that's kind of the joy of working with something that doesn't have any JavaScript or anything and doesn't interact with anything. There aren't bugs. She was like, so it wouldn't like go down. And I was just like, well, in this particular case, no, because this is how it works. And it like kind of touched on this conversation in a little bit where that's kind of where some lines are, where the website doesn't necessarily go down because a lot of people are on it, for example.
Or because you tried to push a change that would break it. Like that's,
Yeah.
I don't know if that's actually a core tenet anymore, but like I've got 11 sites from like version 0.4 that I'm sure would not build anymore. Right. Like either I shut down the CMS that was provided. Yeah, like it might not, but you know what? The website is still up and the website is still running because it's, as Zach said earlier on, right? It's a folder of documents that's on the web. Like that's it. But is that valuable? Is that where this is?
One of the core concepts of the Jamstack it still is one of the core concepts now, but it was like cached static assets that will never change. And now with all the other things on top of it, with edge functions and serverless functions and SSR, actually the whole like immutable deploy concept is broken. And you actually can't guarantee that a change that you push won't break if you're using things like edge functions and serverless functions to get in data like at request. I mean, for example, I use edge functions on my website quite a lot in place of SSR as such, which intercepts the request and does some stuff. But depending on the data that my edge function receives, that means that my home page is not static anymore because it gets my latest Twitch stream. No matter what happens, the whole cached immutable deploy thing is gone forever. And it'd be very interesting to kind of remove that whole piece of technology from the stack, because then you really have to be very clever in a way. And I mean, Mike was telling me about this static search that you generated, the whole without any nonsense. But I would question as to whether that is always going to be static, because, well, it would be every time you build it because it's static and that's what the whole thing was. But then a lot of search is not static, it's dynamic, because you're calling a server when you want to do a search or something, or, you know, you're making a fetch. So maybe we do say that if you're using things like that, it's not Jamstack. You're still making a great website, hopefully, but it's kind of away from that now.
So this is going to sound really weird, and I mean it both jokingly and not at the same time, right? So context. But in you talking about like the immutability of it, and like we're talking about like you can't push things that break it, and all that's being broken right now and how everything is the Jamstack, if we flavored it as this is TypeScript for web development, right? Like it's compiled, right? Like that's kind of what we're saying is if you were to compile your website and put it somewhere, it can't break.
Yeah,
So
I think that's
Jamstack TypeScript.
It's kind of aligned with what Cassidy was saying before, where it's a mobile app. The idea where it's built and that's the complete product, and it can do API calls out of it, but it's a compiled app.
Yeah, I mean, I think the static site or the static search example that someone brought up is a good one. Because yes, the search indexes are all generated and pre-built, and those don't change. But the search functionality is JavaScript first. It needs JavaScript to run, and it has to have that JavaScript piece to get search results. And that's part of it. And so for me, it comes down to this awkward conversation around a site's portability. Can I take my site and easily deploy it on a different provider? And I think when it came to Jamstack as sort of this marketing-driven term by a hosting provider, a single hosting provider, that was sort of an awkward thing to talk about at the same time.
There were other
portability was not something they wanted.
There were other hosting providers that used it, but then they realized a different hosting provider really claimed it, and so they moved away. But there were others that were just like, "Oh yeah, we do this too." But I do think that the portability thing is huge, and also just like being able to dive into a code base without having to like set up Docker, make sure Postgres is enabled, like all these things. Where like there were times where, for example, at Netlify, when I did like a rotation on the engineering team, I just npm installed and I was able to work on the code base. And that was it. And it was so nice, instead of having to do like an onboarding with an engineer to be just like, okay, make sure this is the configuration file you have. You do this, that, and the other. It was just done.
Seed your database and then
go. Yeah. Yeah, that part is very, very nice.
I mean, yeah, that's kind of the other sort of cool thing about, I don't know, I feel like databases are the weird gray area there when you come to development cycles. And that's one of the things I like about SQLite too, is that your database is basically a static file in your repo, which is kind of nice. Has a certain level of portability aspect to it.
And I also like what Salma said earlier about atomic deploys, and the fact that like you could just pick a deploy and go back to it. And if you deploy something wrong, you just press the button and it's done because it was built and it just existed there. And again, I was helping this person learn to code yesterday, and she was asking about this word game I made called Jumbly, where it's just a daily word game. You click buttons, you find words. And she was asking, wait, you built this with the same things that you showed me? And I was like, yeah, it's just HTML, CSS, JavaScript. And I was showing her things. And I was able to say the first version of it was truly just letters on a page. And I was able to just click the old deploy and show it to her right away without having to revert a bunch of Git commits and set everything up. It was just a button. And that is so nice when it comes to the atomic and immutable deploys.
See, I have an opposite story. So when I refactored my personal website from Next.js to 11t, I then wrote a big blog post about all of the things of why I did it. Here's my performance data. Here's how good it is now. And I put a link to the old Netlify URL to the old Next.js site in the blog post so people could reference it and see it. It doesn't work now because the front page relied on some SSR that and the API for that for Twitch. I always show stuff on my homepage from Twitch. The Twitch API broke it. It changed, right? Different version. And so now my homepage from 2 years ago, I can't access anymore on the last deploy because it relied on the things that would break the static whole thing. I was actually using ISR on the front page, and that's why it broke, because ISR was the kind of one of the first things that kind of broke this whole immutability thing, because even between refreshes of the page, it's different, and it might not be different, but it might be different, and you never know. So that's the opposite. It's quite annoying for me, actually, because I really want to have a look at that page and compare what I had, and I can't, get the repo up and running again. There's no point. It'd be painful because it was like Next 11 or something, and who wants to migrate from 4 major versions? But so yeah, that's my story.
For those who don't know what ISR is, I'm just going to do a quick little spiel.
Good idea.
It stands for incremental static regeneration. Mouthful. There's also like deferred static generation, and there's all of these different ones. But the concept is you make your core pages, and then you define routes that could exist, that have content that could exist, but it's not a part of your core build. When a user first goes to that route that could exist, the page is built for them, and then from then on, it's statically built a part of the build. But things can change, and it kind of breaks, just like what Salma said, where because it's not part of the static page, certain things don't work like they normally would because it's not a part of the original build.
Yeah, I think with that approach, like, it was necessary because we have long build times with particular SSGs, and it was really marketed as it's almost static. It's static except the first request.
It's not static yet.
Yeah, but like I feel like that glosses over, to Salma's point, a lot of kind of issues about portability, about just having like consistency or reliability of your content.
Yeah, and I mean, it in many cases that was the original thing that broke the immutable deploys contract. And yeah, Salma saw that in our site, and I've seen that on my site too. We had a section of the 11D documentation that was like our authors pages that showed all the community showcase sites that people have built with 11D, and I switched those to be sort of dynamically generated and cached after first request, and yeah, that broke a few times. And yeah, those are now part of the static build now instead of being dynamically generated, just because it's fewer headaches.
What's really interesting is I feel like looking at some of the pieces of 11D from the past couple of years showcases maybe even better than like all the fancy Next and Astro and stuff like that, like how important it is, and how when you introduce just a little bit of that functionality, because 11D has very little of that functionality built in, like the questions it raises, like you're breaking part of a homepage. I wouldn't think an 11D homepage could have that, right? Or like you were talking about vendor lock-in, right? When you released 11D serverless, right? Like there were things that had to change to make 11D serverless work in different platforms. when really it shouldn't. And there should be a standard for some of the things that are being written. And to Cassidy's point about the browser being an OS, there's standards for the browser. There should potentially be standards for these things that are important to the way that modern websites should be built, right? Like the way serverless works and the way that edge functions work. And these should all have broader conventions that don't get broken contracts.
Yeah, I mean, in some respects, it feels like each of these different hosting providers have created their own versions of PHP.
Every
And
JavaScript framework just wants this. They want to be PHP.
you have to write your code that works in all of these different PHP versions, and it's just not something that I feel like framework developers want to do, or good work that we should be spending time on. But that's the vendor lock-in aspect of this whole discussion, right? Is that folks want the code to be written to their specific hosting APIs, and they don't want it to be easy to swap to others.
Yeah, totally. I want to highlight 2 comments here. Sean, definitely resonate with building websites generally in the same way. I think a big challenge previously has been how to talk about handling the small parts of the site that are best solved in non-Jamstacky patterns. Salma had a good point before where, like, I think there's all this, there was all this conversation about like, but it's not Jamstack. And I feel like we got dogmatic about Jamstack. Like, we shouldn't pitch Jamstack as a silver bullet for every use case, best thing ever. It should be pitched as it's great at these use cases, it's not so good at these ones. I feel like that's a more like intellectually honest answer, and for a newcomer to web development, they can grapple and get their head around what it is.
What's confusing, though, is that you can build a Jamstack site with a particular framework. And if we're talking about Jamstack in this immutable deploy cache static way, so you can use that framework and build a Jamstack site, but you can use the same framework and build a completely un-Jamstack site at the same time. And I think what's confusing for a lot of people, general public in the world, is that often terms like Jamstack are coupled to technology and tools and frameworks. And I think that's what's going to be difficult, because a lot of people might say, oh yeah, I used this framework, it's obviously a Jamstack site, when it's completely SSR'd and uses all sorts of fancy schmancy JavaScript to do stuff. So that's probably a challenge to think about, that there might need some clarity around.
And if I might just shout at capitalism, I think we pulled in a whole lot of things saying, yes, that counts for the shareholders. Because if it counts, then that means it can be hosted on this thing. And if we end up saying these are the guarantees you have, these are the rules, then yes, it gets rid of certain things, but it's better for the community and the learners, and not necessarily the companies that host them.
So many thumbs up.
Yep. I only have the 2 hands. I'd give you 4, but not possible.
That's amazing.
So let's try and figure out what those core pillars are. So Bob suggested mostly static, APIs at build time or client side, highly portable, straightforward local dev setup.
Love it.
I want to question mostly.
Yeah, I agree.
Because if you're saying mostly, you could probably use ISR then, incremental static regeneration, and then it's broken.
It's like when you have that little window to get out of it, it'll happen, right?
How about immutably static?
That's too jargony, I'd think, to bring in community, but we need a word that means that.
Yeah, because I like the immutable deploys once, and again, like talking about standards, right? Everyone has that now. Like you go to any of like the main hosts, right? And you get this idea of being able to roll back to a deploy really easily. But it's not necessarily the deploy that matters. It's the code that then gets shipped to the browser that matters. And so, yeah, immutable is a terrible word. I barely know what it means.
Yeah, because if you rerun your build with an earlier version of your code, your underlying data might change, and that could break your site. Just like the Twitch API example that we just talked about.
Yeah.
What if we said something maybe compiles to HTML, CSS, and JavaScript? How do you feel?
But what would it be otherwise if it's served in a browser?
Build time compiles. I think it's maybe the.
I think when you say compile, you mean build time, and that means
that's true. Yeah.
Although again, like it depends on who we're trying to pull into this community. It was like my joke about TypeScript earlier. If we're really trying to get tons of like senior plus folks into the community, a compiler is so much cooler sounding than just build time.
Sounds like you've got your capitalist hat on there, Bryan.
I know. And
I think it should be the opposite. I think everyone starting out web development, this should be a really nice place to start and a good introduction to the fundamentals of the web.
You know what's really interesting about that to me, Mike, is so I think it's Cassidy. Cassidy was talking earlier about teaching her friend, and I taught journalism students HTML and CSS, and then eventually I also taught the second semester of it too that included JavaScript. And eventually I started they were using Dreamweaver. That's how they were building their websites, not the code editor in Dreamweaver, the graphical side. And I said, no. If you're going to take this class, you're going to learn the code. And we started with HTML and CSS. But then I started thinking, I can't teach them FTP. And where am I going to have them FTP to nowadays? And there's this interesting thing where other than the drag and drop, Netlify kind of upload, which exists, I think, in most of the platforms nowadays, that's not really the tech part of it, right? That's not how that works underneath it all. And it's how much do you have to go into teaching some of this stuff to actually get them doing it the right way? It's let's talk about Git, and we're going to get you a GitHub account, and then we're going to teach you how to do pull requests. And it's going to freeze a lot of juniors up pretty quick, I think. Anyway, that's a different conversation, maybe.
Yeah, I think the other thing I think of here is that I don't consider a build to be a requirement of a Jamstack site either, which is maybe a super awkward part.
Is an HTML file a Jamstack site?
Yes, absolutely is. Yes, that's what I say. That is, yes.
But as the developer, have you pre-built it?
No,
he's pre-built it right here.
You are the builder.
No, I baked it.
It's
like cake. Going back to the beginning.
We haven't talked about the cake since the beginning, though, Salma. I don't know if that's an analogy anymore.
I like pre-baked. It works nicely, and it kind of is a reference to Aaron Swartz's "Bake Don't Fry," which is nice. But to your point, it's not inclusive of just pure HTML site, or is HTML just already pre-baked?
I mean, I would say it's delivered as.
Yeah, that's because it is about the
delivery.
Yeah, I like that delivered as.
Yeah. It's if you looked in the network tab, you would see a full HTML document.
Well, you would with PHP too. So.
Well, so do we want to say a CDN?
Yes. You see, this brings me to. Do you remember? You might remember. You might not. In 2022, I co-authored the Jamstack chapter of the Web Almanac with Laurie Voss. And we were actually trying to come up with a definition of Jamstack at that point, given how broad it was. And we settled on it's served from a CDN and cached for a long time. And that was pretty much it. And that was the only requirement. But that also was problematic because some cache headers were inaccurate anyway. I don't know. But so I don't know whether that's too technical, because as a developer building a website, uploading your files or building your files on a hosting provider, you shouldn't really need to worry about that. And it shouldn't really be a thing I'm going to create a website and I'm going to cache it for a long time.
That's
I'm
a
not
community
sure.
about caching for a long time.
So if we talk about CDN, if I upload an HTML file, literally if I found a server that let me FTP it and put it on a server and knew how to make it serve the HTML index.html directly from the root, right? Is that Jamstack, or is that at that point too broad to be meaningful?
I mean, there's nothing happening apart from getting the HTML document, is there? Like, there's no server building it. So maybe that could come into it. Like, a server doesn't build your files. That could be like, what is Jamstack not? You could kind of try and say, like, it's not built. The HTML is not constructed at request time. And so I would say that, yes, Brian, that probably would be a Jamstack site by our definitions.
Yeah.
And that's okay, right? It sounds weird to say that because of what we're used to and how we're used to this type of building being so coupled to the new modern cloud providers that exist.
Capitalism.
But you could serve, I could have a local server here, really, couldn't I? I mean, technically, if we're talking about CDN, I've got to have a server here and a server in Cassidy's bedroom and a server in Zach's bedroom for the distributed network. But we could mesh our network together and we could serve a static HTML file from it. And that would be a Jamstack site, I'd say.
But what if I just have my server in my bedroom and I'm serving one file from it and it's the only server in the world that you can get it from?
Is it portable?
Yeah,
I could put that HTML file on any server I wanted to, but for now, it is just on the one server.
I don't think CDN is a minimum viable Jamstack site. I don't think you need a CDN for that.
I would agree, because that's the capitalism talking, isn't it? That's a technology, that's a way of building websites attached to a product that makes money and revenue for the shareholders.
So this is a good time to announce
to get us there.
This panel's sponsored by Cloudflare.
So was that a joke or not a joke?
It was a joke.
Zach was worried for
all
a second.
We're panicking.
I'm trying to figure out if I could laugh.
I think these two words do a lot of the work, because if it's portable and immutable, by definition, it kind of has to be this, right? Or although you could PHP's
request time generated stuff. Yeah.
Here's my rationale for saying CDN, and maybe this might counter the bedroom server thing. If Beyonce tweets about your website and all of her fans start going to it, would it go down?
Yeah,
it shouldn't. And that's where like your home server might get a little hot and spicy as people try to go to your website, but it shouldn't, because it's all pre-built. It shouldn't be doing any computation. It should just serve it.
But technically, right now, one of our pillars, if we're thinking of this as pillars, is not actually always up. Now, it could be, but we haven't said in this new Jamstack world that always up is what we're saying. We're saying doesn't break necessarily, but I'd almost say efficient. Always up is more of a pillar than CDN. There might be other ways that we can make always up happen.
That
what
makes
if we
sense.
take it a step higher and to your point, Cassidy, why do we have a CDN? Is it about performance, or is it about reliability and scalability?
Both.
And is that a core pillar? Are we saying if your website's slow or it goes down, it's not Jamstack?
When you talk about reliability, you move into the territory that Cassidy doesn't want to go into, such as I don't ever want to think about or touch servers. And so as someone who is going to join a Jamstack community because they want to learn more about it, when you get the word reliability in there, like, oh my gosh, I know nothing about keeping my servers reliable, so I'm out.
Yeah,
I'm starting to rethink it a little bit. Because
there's actually an interesting comment.
That's great.
Yeah. There's an interesting comment in chat right now from Bob, narrowing it to use cases that are needed by enterprises by saying CDN, that I would actually counter a little bit and say there are times when all of a sudden some piece of my website has gotten hammered just because it, popped off on Hacker News or whatever, right? Like, it's not necessarily just the enterprises that need that, although definitely using terms like CDN are much more technology focused, but I mean, so is reliability and all of that. It's much more around the feelings of enterprise than it is what anyone actually needs. I got lost in the weeds on that, but I think it's an interesting point to raise.
But then Big and Low says, I think CDN weakens the core Jamstack angle. Jamstack should thrive without the need for a CDN.
So the Beyonce example, right? Like, the funny thing is, when you talk about the reliability of it, at that point, I've got my one little server in my bedroom. My ISP is almost more important even than the server at that point, to make sure I'm getting all of the throughput for all that. And I'm not a hardware person, but like, to make sure all that traffic can get in and out of the server. There's only so much space in a pipe, right? Like, the unicorns have to travel through, but like that, I wouldn't ever want to think about the ISP when it comes to Jamstack either. I want all of that taken care of. I've managed a rack space server. I'm never doing that again. Like, I fear the server, just like Cassidy said earlier. But like, how do we communicate that in a way that is not prescriptive to CDN, but is more I think the portability of it, right? It can go anywhere, which means it could be served from a CDN from any number of ways, or you could literally build your own CDN if you wanted to. If you're that big a company, go for it.
So maybe the word portable is enough. We don't, and that's just it.
And I like portable. I mean, I think portable is there no matter what, but because it's very anti-capitalist, which makes me just so
yes. Okay, so the value of Jamstack, when Mike's talking about the values, I think we're sensing a theme that one of the values of Jamstack is anti-capitalist.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, when you think about how Netlify really did it early on, it felt very anti-capitalist to a degree. I'm sure there were plenty of conversations behind the scenes, right? But like, sure, the idea that people would ask questions about Netlify in the Jamstack Slack channel, right? And people would say, no, talk to support. Like, this is not net. Like, I know that that's like ticket deflection and stuff like that. You have to say, like, this isn't Netlify support for a variety of reasons. But it felt like one of the reasons was also like, we don't want this to be Netlify support. We want this to be about a broader topic. Again, I'm sure there were different conversations elsewhere, but it was a good feeling to look at it that way and to say, this is a community not for Netlify, but for a broader topic.
And for what it's worth, I think before, in earlier days, I do think that it was meant to be not just Netlify. It's just, once again, VC money speaks. We can
it's
leave
hard.
With that.
It's real hard.
Bryce says, never thought I'd see a CEO type down with capitalism.
Yeah, it's true.
Oh, brilliant.
All right, let's do a quick rundown of the comments, and then we've got to wrap it up. Where are we? Thinking that has no bugs and Beyonce can break it are the only requirements we really need.
I think that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm good with that.
Yep.
Wait, are we getting rid of the CDN bullet point then? What did we decide?
I think we did decide that, yeah.
Okay, see you later.
You see, that is a beautiful set of pillars. 3 pillars, very beautiful, very simple, although we do need new words.
Yeah.
Immutable's terrible.
Yeah,
worst
we could
ever.
spend an hour just going over semantics, but I feel like those are the core ideas.
It's a good start.
Yeah. And I think it really goes back to those initial ideas behind the Jamstack as well, I think. Yeah, feels good. Okay, well, we've resolved the Jamstack issue.
We did it.
On to the next
Good
one.
job. Now let's solve funding and open source, shall we?
I was going to say hunger, but I like your idea better.
Thank you, everyone, for joining today. Chat, you were awesome. You brought in a lot of great ideas. All the panelists, this is an awesome conversation. Let's do it again sometime.
Let's do it again. I had fun.
Thanks,
Yeah,
y'all.
Thanks.
Thanks, y'all.
Thanks, Tim.